Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, let me know where you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you. Last fall, my best friend Sarah and I decided to take a break from our hectic lives and head to a small cabin nestled in the hills of Vermont. It seemed like the perfect way to unwind, far from the noise of the city, surrounded by nature. Sarah had found the cabin online. It was advertised as a peaceful retreat with stunning mountain views, complete with a cozy fireplace to keep us warm. The thought of crisp air and quiet nights sounded like exactly what we needed. We packed our bags, loaded up my car, and hit the road one afternoon. The journey was smooth at first, but the road became smaller as we neared the cabin. Eventually, it was just a winding path through tall trees. By the time we arrived, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. The cabin was small but charming, with one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a fireplace that seemed a little worn out. All around us was just the peaceful silence of the forest. After unpacking, we decided to go for a walk before it got too dark. The woods were eerily still, the kind of quiet that made you feel like something was watching. Our footsteps crunched in the snow as we followed a narrow trail between the trees. That's when we heard it. A distant cry, almost like a howl, but unmistakably human. We stopped and exchanged uneasy looks. Then it came again, this time clearer, almost pleading. "We should check it out," Sarah said. She was always the brave one, while I tended to be more cautious. I wanted to ignore it and head back, but something inside me urged me to help. We followed the sound, our hearts racing as the cries grew louder. Eventually, we saw a dim light through the trees. It was an old cabin, even more run down than ours. The windows were filthy and the roof sagged under the weight of the snow. Inside, the flickering light seemed to come from a fire or lantern. As we crept closer, the screams stopped. Now there was only a low, broken sound, someone gasping, or maybe crying. Sarah motioned for me to stay back while she peeked through the window. She wiped away some frost and looked inside. When she turned back to me, her face was as pale as the snow. "There's a man tied up," she whispered, "and there's someone else wearing a mask, holding a knife." My stomach dropped. For a second, I couldn't move. Before I could say anything, a voice suddenly rang out behind us. "What are you doing here?" We spun around. A man stood a few feet away, tall and broad-shouldered. He was wearing a dark coat and boots, his face hidden beneath a hood. His eyes were hidden in the shadows, but I could feel his gaze, cold and sharp. Neither of us spoke. Sarah grabbed my arm and we ran. The man shouted something, but we didn't stop. The snow crunched beneath our feet as we sprinted, the sound of his heavy footsteps growing closer. My breath came in quick gasps, my legs burning, but I didn't dare look back. We reached the cabin and slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. For a moment, we stood there in silence, trying to catch our breath. Then we turned off the lights and peered through the window, waiting. The man didn't come. Outside, the forest was still. Only the wind whistled through the trees. Sarah called the police, and it felt like hours before they finally arrived, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. We rushed out to meet them, explaining everything: the screams, the tied-up man, and the masked figure who had chased us. The officers seemed skeptical but agreed to check out the other cabin. We led them through the dark woods, our flashlights cutting through the blackness. When we reached the cabin, I felt a cold pit in my stomach. The place was completely empty, no lights, no signs of anyone. We packed up and left the cabin that same day. The forest no longer felt peaceful. It felt haunted, as if it had secrets it wanted to keep hidden. Now that we're back home, I can't shake the memory of that night. The screams, the masked man, and the chase still haunt me. I wonder what really happened in that cabin, who those men were, and why one of them had been tortured. The authorities never gave us any more answers, and maybe it's better that way. But sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I still hear that voice in the forest, cold and sharp. "What are you doing here?" It was January 2020, and I was living in a quiet town in New Hampshire. That winter was unusually cold, and the weather reports had been warning us about an intense snowstorm coming our way. I had always imagined New Hampshire to be a place of gentle winters, Not the kind of harsh storms that would blanket everything in thick, silent snow. But that night, everything was coated in white. It looked like the world had been dipped in powdered sugar. My bedroom was on the second floor, and I woke up around 3 a.m., feeling groggy and needing to use the bathroom. The house was unnervingly silent, the kind of silence that made it feel like even the walls were holding their breath. As I swung my legs off the bed, I looked out the window to see how much snow had fallen. Earlier that day, I'd been excited about the storm, curious to see how the town would look under all that snow. But when I pulled the curtain aside, I froze. The snow was deeper than I could ever remember. It covered everything, even the streets, creating a smooth and untouched layer that stretched as far as I could see. The streetlights above cast a soft glow over the snow, making it almost shimmer in the dark. There was no sign of anyone, no cars, no footprints, nothing but a vast blanket of stillness. It was beautiful, almost like a scene from a dream. I decided to get a drink of water after using the bathroom. The old tiles in the bathroom floor sent a chill through my bare feet, but I didn't think much of it. The air felt colder than usual, but maybe that was the snowstorm. As I walked down the stairs and turned on the kitchen light, I felt something strange. The house felt emptier than usual, like the storm outside had swallowed up any trace of life inside. I grabbed a glass and took a quick drink. As I stood there, letting the light fully reach my eyes, I heard it. A soft click. It came from the direction of the front door. My first thought was that it was just a branch or something else being blown against the house by the wind. I shrugged it off and turned off the light, heading back upstairs. As I walked up the stairs, they creaked beneath my weight, as they always did. When I got to my room, I glanced out the window again. This time, something was different. There were fresh footprints in the snow, footprints that weren't there just a few minutes ago. They started at the edge of my driveway and led toward my neighbor's house. I stared at the tracks, trying to understand what I was seeing. There was no way someone could have walked that quickly in the few minutes since I last looked outside. I leaned forward, peering closer. The footprints didn't loop back, they just vanished behind the neighbor's house as if the person had disappeared into thin air. A cold shiver ran down my spine, but I tried to push it aside. It was probably just someone out late, maybe a neighbor or a car passing by. I told myself it wasn't a big deal, but that night I didn't sleep. I kept glancing out the window, watching for any movement in the snow. By morning, the storm had passed and everything outside was still. When I went downstairs, I found my parents in the living room. They looked uneasy, my mom sitting on the couch with her hands clenched tightly, and my dad pacing back and forth. "What's going on?" I asked, rubbing my eyes to wake up. My dad stopped and turned to me. "Your mom's jewelry is missing," he said. That jewelry was special. It wasn't just expensive. It was a gift my dad had given to my mom on their anniversary. She didn't wear it much, but she kept it in a small wooden box in their bedroom. I asked, how could this happen?" "We don't know," my dad said. "We didn't hear anything, but it's gone." That's when I remembered the footprints. My heart began to race as I told them about what I had seen the night before. The fresh tracks leading from our house to the neighbor's yard. My dad's face grew serious and he said we needed to check the security cameras. We rushed to the small monitor connected to our cameras. My dad rewound the footage to the time I'd gone downstairs. At first, everything looked normal. The front door camera showed nothing but the snowstorm, and the backyard footage was the same. But when my dad switched to the camera inside the kitchen, we all froze. The footage showed me walking into the kitchen, turning on the light, and getting a glass of water. But in the corner of the screen, near the doorway to the dining room, there was a figure. A man, tall, thin, and dressed in dark clothes, standing perfectly still. His head was tilted slightly. I didn't notice him at all, my mom gasped, covering her mouth. My dad cursed under his breath. We rewound the footage again and again, trying to make out the man's face, but it was too blurry. The camera wasn't good enough to catch any details. The man must have slipped out while I was going back upstairs. Maybe that was the click I heard, the door opening and closing. We called the police immediately, but when they arrived, they couldn't do much. The officers checked the footage and said it wasn't clear enough to identify the intruder. They followed the footprints outside, but the snowstorm had started again, covering the tracks. The police told us to be more careful, to lock all the doors and windows, and to improve our security. But that was it. No leads, no answers. For weeks after that, I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the footage. How long had he been in our house? Did he watch me come downstairs? What would have happened if I had noticed him? It was December in rural Oregon, and the world outside my window was covered in snow. The blanket of white was thick, nearly 2 feet deep, and everything felt eerily still, as if the snow had muted the entire town. My parents were out visiting friends, and my sister was at a sleepover, so I had the house all to myself. I enjoyed the solitude, wrapping up in a cozy blanket on the couch in the living room, watching a movie with the dim glow of the TV lighting up the room. The only sound was the steady tick of the clock on the wall, marking the slow passage of time. I had just finished a bag of popcorn when I heard it, a faint tapping noise coming from the attic. At first I thought it was just the old house settling, the usual creaks and groans of wood and pipes that I'd grown used to over the years. But this sound was different. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Curiosity got the best of me, and I reluctantly stood up, wrapping the blanket around my shoulders like a cape for some extra courage. I walked toward the attic stairs, my feet cold against the floorboards. The air felt oddly heavier as I reached the door to the attic. I hesitated, then opened the door and flicked the light switch. The light flickered once, then stayed steady, casting long shadows across the attic floor. I slowly climbed the stairs, the wood creaking under my feet. When I reached the top, I scanned the room. Everything looked normal. The attic smelled like old wood and forgotten things, boxes stacked in corners, old furniture covered in dust, and a few items I didn't recognize shoved behind a tarp. No signs of movement, nothing that could have caused the noise. Sighing, I decided it was just the wind playing tricks on me. I went back downstairs, shut the attic door behind me, and returned to the couch. Just as I started to settle in again, I heard it. A loud crash from above, followed by the sound of something heavy being knocked over. My heart skipped a beat as I sat up, staring at the ceiling. This time the noise was undeniable, a sharp, clear sound. I hesitated. The house suddenly felt too still, too quiet. The shadows around me seemed deeper, and I felt a chill creeping into my bones. My hands were trembling as I stood and slowly approached the attic door again. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was my sister playing a prank on me. Maybe she'd come home early, or maybe it was just some critter getting into the house. I called her name as I opened the door, but my voice was shaky. "Ellie, is that you?" Silence. I tried again, louder this time, but all I could hear was the faint hum of the attic light. I swallowed hard and started up the stairs again, my nerves on edge. When I reached the top, the light flickered again, and what I saw made my stomach twist. The once neat piles of boxes were now knocked over. Papers were scattered across the floor, and old furniture had been pushed aside. It looked like someone had been rummaging through everything, searching for something specific. The worst part was the attic window. It was wide open. The freezing cold air rushed in, and I could see the snow drifting into the room. I froze for a moment. Footprints in the fresh snow outside. They started right under the open window and led off into the darkness, disappearing into the yard. My heart pounded. Someone had been in my house. Someone had been up here just a few steps away from me, and I hadn't heard a thing. Panic surged through me. I rushed to the window and slammed it shut, locking it as quickly as I could. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone and called my parents. My mom answered, and I tried to explain everything, my voice trembling. She told me to stay put, that they'd be home soon. When they arrived, my dad grabbed a flashlight, and they went outside to follow the footprints. My mom stayed with me, her hand on my shoulder trying to calm me down. My dad's boots crunched through the snow as he followed the tracks across the yard, over the fence, and into the street behind our house. He came back a few minutes later, shaking his head. The footprints stopped at the road, and whoever had been there had probably gotten into a car and driven off. The police arrived shortly after. They inspected the attic and the window, making notes as they searched for any signs of forced entry. But there was nothing. No broken locks, no signs of a break-in. The window had simply been left open. My dad insisted he had locked it earlier, but maybe it hadn't latched properly. The officer suggested it might have been a random burglary, someone seeing an empty house and taking a chance, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. The way everything had been rifled through so methodically, it felt personal. Like whoever it was had been looking for something specific.